survive this. The things we think will provide for us, and they don't. They leave us empty and hollow and afraid, and we just don't get it sometimes. So Lord, help us to turn our minds and our faith and our attention to you. To stop looking to other things to give us wisdom or to give us peace or to give us strength. In your most precious Son's name, amen. Well, today we are continuing our series called Counterfeit Gods, Defeating the Idols That Battle for Your Hearts. Now, in this series, we've covered a lot of different things. One of the things that we started out with talking about was that how real idolatry is. Even in modern America, the reality is that idolatry exists. I mean, we struggle with it, even though we don't struggle with it. And when, traditionally people think, well, idolatry means you carve a statue and you fall down and worship a rock or a tree or something. That's not what we're talking about. Idolatry is worshiping anything other than God. If you put anything center focus, if it's the most important thing in your entire world, then it's your idol. It's the thing you worship. And so we've talked about that. We've talked about how good things can be turned into gods when they take the place in our lives that only belongs to the one true God. And so we talked about the God of food and how we can let food take over, and it becomes the thing that controls us and determines and guides our decisions. Or the God of sex, or the God of attainment, or the God of success. All of those things can be taken out of proportion. I mean, all of those things were created by God. There's nothing wrong with them in and of themselves. The problem is when they get out of balance, when they become the thing that we worship rather than the one who gave it to us. Instead of recognizing this as a gift from God and we use it to glorify Him, we use it to glorify ourselves. And so I want to talk about the God of money today. Now, our relationship money begins very early. Generally, we learn about it from our parents. We see the pull and the power that money has on our mom and dad, or on our grandparents, or on our uncles and aunts, or even on our older brothers and sisters. Money is an integral part of our world, at least in the Western civilization, Western hemisphere. Now, I realize that there's places in this country, and places in this world where money in the traditional sense isn't that important because they don't have money. But they do accumulate things. And any society that doesn't have a printed dollar or coins has things that they consider valuable and they hoard them. And the one who has the most of those things considers himself successful. And so, one day a man came home to his wife and a 3-year-old daughter after a hard day at work, and he came to his daughter and says, "Do you have a kiss for your daddy?" And she just looked at him and says, "No, I'm not kissing you, Daddy." And she said, "I'm so hurt. I worked so hard all day to bring home money, and this is how you treat me? Come on, can't I have a kiss?" And she looks her dad right in the eye and says, "I'll give you a kiss when you give me my money." The reality is that we live in a world where everything is what's in it for me. We live in a society that's all about what's in it for me. And the reality is the God of money wants us to think that winning means getting lots of money. We daydream about how much money. It's funny, when I was a lot younger, and I do mean a lot younger, my daydream was to win $1 million. And I had all these plans for it. I realized the other day that $1 million wouldn't be that much of a big deal. That might be a couple of tanks of gas. So, money isn't going to solve your problems. It isn't going to be the solution. The reality is, the God of money wants us to think that the more money we have, the happier we'll be and the better our lives will be. But it really doesn't work that way. Yeah, I know, Transit. Kyle Idleman says, sometimes we hear rich people say things like, well, money doesn't make you happy. And most of us think, oh, they all flew first class to some exotic location and they got together and agreed to say that to make the rest of us feel better. But here's the truth. having a lot of money doesn't necessarily lead to happiness. One of the wealthiest men in the world was a guy named J.D. Rockefeller. He was the founder of Standard Oil. And back then, when $1 million meant a lot of money, he was a billionaire. And a millionaire was almost exceptional, and he had more than that. And he was asked one time, you accumulate all this money, you're always getting more and more and more. When is enough enough? This is when I get that next dollar, and then that next dollar, and then that next dollar. And only when I get all the dollars that are there will I have enough. Because I'm never satisfied with what I get. Let me tell you something. Money is an article which may be used as a universal passport to everywhere except heaven, in the kingdom of God. And as a universal provider for everything except happiness and our relationship with Jesus Christ. Back in 1999, Brad Pitt did an interview, and in the interview he responded to people's illusion that he had the perfect life because he had all this money. And he said, you got it wrong. When you've got everything, when you think you've got everything you ever wanted, what you find out is you really have nothing, and you're left alone with yourself. And it doesn't help you sleep any better, and it doesn't wake up any better, because money doesn't solve your problems. And it never does. God, who is the person who has God, has everything. And the God and has everything, has no more than the person who has God and has nothing. It's equal. You know why? Because what's important? It's not the things. It's not the things that give you importance. It's not the things that give you the happiness. If you have God, you have all you need. And you can be living in poverty in the middle of nowhere. And if you have God, you have all you need. But you can have everything this world has to offer. And if you do not have God, you have nothing. So today, I want to kind of look at these two people. These two biblical people that we know about. That the reality is that they struggled with money. So it's something we truly believe or willing to work toward believing. You know, is that God is everything, all you need? When God is on his rightful throne in our lives and we are looking to God for all that we need and hope for satisfaction, significance, and security, then we don't need anything more than God. And then money and things are able to be used to bring glory to God, help others, and help ourselves. That's what God gave us money, so that we could glorify him with it. All the gifts God gave us were so that we could use them to glorify the people and lead others to Christ. I have some family friends who grew up, and if you met them tomorrow, if you were to run into them in the mall or in the grocery store, you would never guess that he was one of the richest men on the planet. You never know it. Because his company manufactures one thing, and he's the only company that still manufactures it, and every car that was ever made has to have them. Every plane that ever flew, they're called bearings. And his company manufactures bearings. And they're the only company in the world that manufactures bearings. He grew up as a crop duster. He flew a crop dusting plane after he got out of the army. When his dad died, he gave him the company because the industry had been in the family hands for 3 generations. Because that once you got 18, if you wanted to go to college, fine, you go out and go to college, but you pay for it. You went out and get a job, great, you go out and get a job, but I'm not going to help you. You got to take care of yourself. You got to make your own way until you inherit the company. And that's exactly what this guy did. Now, his son and I grew up together. How rich they were, and never would have known it. Because money didn't mean anything to them. He had what he needed most, and that was his relationship with Jesus Christ. And everything else was used to glorify God. Most people didn't know how rich they really were. I do know that he donated money to the church, but he wanted it anonymously. He didn't want anybody to know. He was constantly helping and giving people. Now, I will tell you right now that Mr. Stockham's gone on to be with the Lord. Okay, all of this is from when I was a teenager, and this was a friend of mine's dad. My friend is now in his 60s, so his dad would be 90 something, because Drew was his youngest son. But it was all about being generous, and he wasn't serving money. When we compare our financial standing and handling of money, we rarely compare ourselves with those who have less. Rather, we usually compare ourselves with those who have more. And we tend to justify ourselves saying, well, I don't live as well as him or her and them. My means and lifestyle is modest compared to them, so I am not under greed's grip. And as a result, most Americans think of themselves as middle class. They call themselves, and only 2% of the population of the United States consider themselves upper class or wealthy, or well off even. The reality is that our Congress, and this is the sad truth, is that 51% of the members of 51% of all the billionaires in the United States are members of our Congress and our Senate. Most of them didn't start that way, but they are now. What does that tell you about our House and our Senate? Okay. Yeah. You know, we live in a world where money is very different in different places. Again, accumulation of things is what we're talking about. It's not a matter of just money. It's accumulation of what we would consider wealth. And we are using the term money because we understand that, but the reality is there are places where you might make $1 a day if you're lucky. You might make 50 cents a day, and that would be a good wage. So I'm not talking necessarily about having money in the terms that we understand, but accumulating wealth, and all you care about is how much you got. The reality is that most Americans are wealthy compared to the world standard. Let me tell you something, and you're wealthy. Every last one of you is wealthy compared to the rest of the world. Every last one of you. You know why I say that? Let me ask you a question. Do you have indoor plumbing? Do you live in a house where you have indoor plumbing that actually works? Do you have a roof over your house that when it rains, you don't get rained on? When it gets cold, you have heat? Do you have electricity? Do you have excess food in the refrigerator? And guess what? You're richer than 95% of the rest of the world. But things aren't what matters. When God is on the rightful throne in our lives and we are looking to God for all we need and hope for, money is meaningless. See, the reality is the human heart, Jesus said it's clear that the person cannot serve both God and money. You can't do it. Mark Twain wrote, "Some men worship rank, some worship heroes, some worship power, and some worship God. And over these ideas, they dispute and cannot unite, but they all worship money." Friedrich Nietzsche, who was very eugenics and believed in master race and all that stuff, he wrote that with the absence of God growing in Western culture, we would replace God with money. Money is now the God of America and the God of Europe. And in some sense, I think Nietzsche was right. But the scary part of that is that most of us are blind to the culture of greed we live in and the grip of greed that often takes hold of us. See, the human heart always seeks to justify itself. We try to serve both, and we end up serving money more than God, and then we justify ourselves, and we make excuses when it comes to money and greed, and the God of money is a master of deception. When we compare our financial standing and handling of money, right, we don't compare it to those who are less often than us. And so we deceive ourselves because we don't want to realize just how wealthy and how much God has blessed us. The biblical writers, especially Jesus, had a lot to say about money. Did you know that there are 450 different biblical passages that deal with how you handle money? The issue of money forms the second most dominant motif in the entire Bible, exceeded only by idolatry. And since money is a form of idolatry, by the love of money is a form of idolatry, I guess it really can be included as idolatry. Nearly 1/6 of the recorded statements by Jesus concerned money. Jesus warns people far more often about greed than he does about sex, and yet almost no one thinks they're guilty of greed. None of us believe, oh, I'm not greedy. Just give me more. I deserve this. Give me, give me, give me, give me, give me. And if that's important to God, that he thinks it's important for us to hear that, then there must be a reason he wants us to hear that. And I think the reason is that greed can easily be a problem for us. It hides itself so deeply and successfully that we may not even realize that we have a problem with it. We glaze over it and we don't think, oh no, I'm not greedy, I'm not selfish. But look at how much I've got in my bank account. Look at that nice car I ride. Look at the big, handsome home I have. I just wish, I wish I just had more. I'm never satisfied with what I got. I want more. Give me, give me, give me, give me. Me, my, I. The person who has everything, who has God and has everything, has no more than the person who has God and has nothing. So you need to learn to focus on what God is and who God is, and learn that he is all that you need. You don't need all the things to make you happy. Greed could easily be a problem for us because it hides itself so deeply and successfully we may not even realize we have a problem. The problem isn't money itself, of course, because money isn't good or bad in and of itself. Okay? Rather, the problem is the love of money. The Apostle Paul wrote, "For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil." 2 Timothy 6:10. So I want to look right now at a guy that we call the rich fool. It's from Luke 12. And one day when Jesus was teaching the crowd of listeners, a man in the crowd spoke up and said, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." And Jesus replied, "Man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you?" Jesus said to the crowd, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. The land of a rich man produced plentifully, and he thought to himself, 'What shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops.' And he said, 'I will do this. I will tear down my barns, and I will build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and all my goods. And I will say to my soul, so you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So it is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God.'" It is likely that the man here is the younger man, right? He comes to Jesus. The tradition was in Jewish society that the oldest brother got 2/3 of the inheritance, and the younger one got 1/3. Okay, that was Levitical law. Jesus was wise enough; he wasn't going to get involved in it, but he tells him, "Don't covet, don't be greedy, don't worry about the money." And then Jesus uses a teachable moment to teach everyone present about the danger of serving the god of money. This story describes someone who is worshiping the god of money. Look at the rich fool. Right? Look closely. Notice what he says. Look at that, what he says right there. And he said, I will do this, and I will tear down my barns, and I will build larger ones, and I will store up all my grain and my goods, and I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods I laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. He says I or my 9 times in those 2 verses. His focus is on what? Do you think he's there? Oh, I'm going to glorify God by creating my barn so that I can feed more people, so I can be more generous? No. What's he thinking about? Me, my, I. I got to have this so that I can have more. I can have bigger barns and everybody will be impressed. We see no acknowledgement from this man that what he actually had came from God. I mean, let's face it, folks. You don't grow food in your own strength and your own power. You can't do anything. God has to provide the increase. You may water and you may weed and you may harvest, but God provides the increase. Things don't grow without God intervening. There is never a thought in the man's mind that he should share what he has with others. It's not about glorifying God. It's not about sharing others. It's just how I can accumulate more. Let me give you the key to keeping money in its primary place. You know what it is? It all belongs to God. Whatever you have, I don't care what it is, it's on loan from God. God didn't give it to you. God loaned it to you. And you are the steward who God used to be in charge of it. Psalm 24:1 clearly states it. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. The contemporary English version puts it this way. The earth and everything on it, including its people, belong to the Lord. The world and its people belong to Him. We have to remember that when we're so tempted to say, well, look at all I've done. Look at this great, wonderful accumulation. All I've accumulated. It's God's. God gave it to use, but you're not the source. Kai Eidelman gave a great suggestion along the line. He wrote, God has given us the use of His resources for a short time, and we have much to be grateful for. Go through your day sometime just recognizing that everything is God's. You get up in the morning, when you get out of the bed that God gave you, it's God's bed, and you walk into God's bathroom, and you turn on God's shower, and then you put on God's clothes, and then you eat God's cereal, or God's oatmeal, or God's breakfast, and you drink God's coffee. You get out the door of God's house, get in God's car, and go to the job that God gave you. And we start to see all our resources as God's. It helps us develop an attitude of, I am so grateful for all you do. It leads you to a heart of worship. Look, if I think I gave myself all this stuff, then all I'm worried about is me. But if I recognize that I'm sitting at the computer that God gave me, I'm sitting in the chair that God gave me, I'm using the voice God gave me, I'm preaching because God gave me this message. All this is God's. Michael Boyd didn't do any of this. Michael Boyd is just a tool used by God. So are you. And so I don't have to be worrying about all this stuff that I think I need. If God chooses to give me an old beater, He gives me an old beater. If He chooses to give me a Lamborghini Countach, I will faint. Because I can't even think of any way I can use that to glorify God. I just don't know how. Now, if He were to give me a van or something like that, where I could do ministry with it, that'd be great. But God will give me what I need, and I don't need to think I did it. And if God gives me the resources to buy something like that, not a Lamborghini, I don't think that's going to happen, but God gave it to me, so I need to turn around and use it to glorify Him. Look, the man looked to money as his source of security. He told himself that he had plenty of good things laid up for many years. And do we accumulate enough where we feel that we are set and we have no worries? All we got to worry about is ourselves. We look to money as our security, it becomes our God. When we look to money as the source of His satisfaction, we've put it in God's place. Satisfaction didn't come from pleasing God, and that's where it's the only place it should come from. Or having a right relationship, but came from money and what money could buy. I'm satisfied because I have all this money. Finally, the man looked to money for his source of significance. And don't we do that? Well, look at me. I've got all this money. Look at all I've accumulated. Everybody's going to be impressed. Everybody's going to respect me and envy me because of how big my barns are. The God of money wants us to believe that our significance comes from what we made ourselves, but our self-worth is a product of our net worth. But that's not true. The rich fool in Luke 12 had got his trust in his money and possessions, and his plan was to retire early and eat, drink, and be merry. But here's the problem. God had other ideas. God called him a fool and took his life from him and brought him home that very night. The man learned the folly of allowing the God of money to lead him to store up treasure for himself, but not being rich toward God the Father. Now I want to talk about the next one, the next person in Scripture, the next story I want to find. I want to talk about a guy named Zacchaeus. Now little Zacchaeus, right, was a tax collector. He lived in Jericho, right? But just like most people in our day don't like the people who work at the IRS, people hated tax collectors who worked for the Roman government. They considered them to be traitors. You see, the way it worked in the Roman government is tax collectors took out a contract. This is how much tax I'll collect. The law said I can collect as much as I want. I've got the power of Rome behind me. So if I want to take 50% of your income, I can. I owe 5% of your income as taxes to the Roman government. So I keep the rest of it, and I put it in my pockets, and I get wealthy doing that. Okay. Not only that, but they were considered spies by the Jewish people because they thought that they were working for the Romans. Even though they were Jewish, they were betrayers. They considered them traitors to the Jewish people. And let me tell you something. They did it because there was a lot of money. Tax collectors were among the wealthiest people in society, and they were among the most hated. And in fact, the Jews had a special word, that tax collectors and sinners, because they were a lower rank than your average murderer as far as they were concerned. They were worse as far as sin goes than a mass murderer. So Zacchaeus hears that Jesus is coming through town. Climbs a tree to be able to get a good look at Jesus. Now, understand that means he's desperate, because in that culture, honor and dignity would have prevented him from climbing a tree because of his position as chief tax collector. Zacchaeus' willingness to climb a tree signifies his desperation. Zacchaeus had more money than he could spend, but he knew that something was missing, and maybe Jesus offered what he needed. To the great surprise of everyone, including Zacchaeus, Jesus called him by name and invited him to eat with Zacchaeus on Zacchaeus' house. When Zacchaeus saw him, that Joseph had chosen him, the least virtuous person in the crowd, for a personal relationship, his whole spiritual understanding began to change. He began to be transformed. Zacchaeus wanted to follow Jesus, and immediately he realized that if he was going to do that, then his relationship with money was an issue and it had to change. He had to replace it. He had to replace the God of money with the one true God. So here he is. He's at his home, in front of Jesus and his guests. Zacchaeus made this declaration: "Behold, Lord, half of my goods I give to the poor today, and if I have defrauded anyone or anything, I restore to it fourfold." How is that for breaking the chains of the God of money? Zacchaeus threw off the chains. He replaced the God of money with the one true God. He promised to give away 50% of his wealth to the poor. He promised to repay people for the ways he had cheated them. And not only just repay them, but he was going to give them 4 times as much as he had cheated them from. Can you imagine the line of people lining up for Zacchaeus to give them stuff? What brought about that amazing transformation? Because Zacchaeus was changed. When Jesus came in Zacchaeus' life, he realized that although he was financially rich, he was spiritually bankrupt. By grace, God was willing to give him spiritual riches. Blessed are those who are poor. Jesus said it right there at the beginning. Blessed are those who are poor. Spiritually poor. Spiritually bankrupt. But they realize they have a need. And God will fill them. When we recognize that we are spiritually poor, then we don't have spiritual riches unless God decides to give them to us. In that moment, Zacchaeus removed the God of money from the throne of his life and replaced it with the God of mercy, Jesus Christ. The thing is, what Jesus did in Zacchaeus' life, he will do for us, each one of us. God will help us to stop serving the God of money, but we must turn it over to him. We have to surrender control. We don't have to end up like the rich fool in Luke 12. Rather, like Zacchaeus, we can wake up to our wrong relationship with money before it's too late. To help us with that, let's ask ourselves some questions for introspection, sort of our conclusion questions. Number one, how often do you compare what you have and what you make to others? Our world and the God of money encourage us to measure our life and our worth by our money and possessions. But we must resist that temptation. That's not who we compare ourselves to. Our standard is God himself. And it's not about money, it's not about wealth, it's not about resources. It's about our relationship with him. Jesus reminds us that a person's life doesn't consist in the abundance of their possessions. Doesn't do it. Number two, how much anxiety do finances add to your life? You're constantly worrying about how I'm going to do this, or scheming on ways you can make money to pay this bill. We may regularly face financial challenges, but how do we try to face them? Do we immediately turn to God and say, God, I can't do this, you do this, and give it to him? Or we scheme and try to figure out ways and find our own efforts and try really hard. And when we finally run out of everything, then, I've got nothing left to do but pray. I'm sorry, I hate that phrase. I'm sorry, but you should never be the last thing you do. It should always be the first thing you do. When you're struggling, when you're hurting, the first thing you do is get down on your knees and pray to God. And then you go do other things that God leads you to. But you always start with God. To what extent are your dreams and goals driven by money? Well, I'll be able to do this if I just have more money. I know churches like that. I know pastors like that. Well, our church really wants to do such and such and such and such, but we just don't have the money to do it, so we're just not going to do that. And the only question I have for people like that is, did God call you to do it? If God called you to do it, you don't need the money. God will take care of it. Henry Blackaby pastored a church in Canada for years and years and years. And he began to realize that their budget process was warped. Because what it did is we said, we'll find out how much we can spend, and then we'll tell God what we're going to do based on how much we can afford. And he said he realized, after a lot of prayer and a lot of study, that he got it backwards. We find out what God wants to do, and then he provides the resources for us to do it. If God wants our church to reach everybody in Second Life, he'll provide the resources for us to do it, and then we won't have to do it on our own. Are our goals and our dreams driven by wealth, by money? Do you tell yourself what would happen if you won the lottery or had some other increase in available wealth? How might you feel differently about yourself if you had more money? Do you think that would change the way you treat others? If you had more money, are you more likely to spend most of it on yourself? Do you know the most lottery winners are bankrupt by the time they're done with their first year after they get the money? Most of them don't keep any of that wealth over a year. You know why? Because they've not learned to be generous with it, and they start spending on themselves, and then they burn through it in a heartbeat. If God blesses you and gives you wealth, he expects you to use it And you need to find out what the purpose He has planned for it. God doesn't give you wealth just for you. He gives you resources and to use them to minister to others, to bring glory to His name. If you had more money, how do you spend it? Number 4, what is your attitude toward giving? Let me tell you that if greed's all you care about, you don't give. You got excuses every time you think about giving away money. And I got news for you folks. God says that if He gives you something and you're faithful with a little, He'll give you a lot. But if you're not faithful with a little, He won't give you a lot. The best way to keep money from controlling you is to give it away. Is to give it and give it and give it and give it. The God of money was almost detestable, irresistible. He spun tales of sports cars and luxury homes as all good things He was going to do for us. Yes, we had heard the old refrain that money can't buy happiness, but we knew that, and we had seen what it had done to other lives over and over again. But you know what? We're different. We would know how to use money without letting it use us. We didn't want to buy happiness. We just wanted to rent it a little. And somewhere along, it all went wrong. Somehow the God of money became a slave driver. Trying to keep him from getting away, we followed the green brick road until we longed for rest. We put our hope in what we might find at the end of the rainbow. We thought money would provide us with security and significance and some measure of success, some measure of satisfaction. Strangely, even when we had money, we still felt broke. And then we found Jesus and discovered that He is our provider. He provides everything we need. He provides us with security because He never leaves us or forsakes us. He provides us with significance because our identity and our value are found in His love only. He provides us with satisfaction because our souls are made for Him. We discovered that God would meet all our needs according to the riches of His glory in Christ Jesus. I want to end with a story from Charles Dickens. I know it's not Christmas, and it's not even July, but I think it's a great illustration of what we've been talking about. The story's main character is a mean, intimidating miser called Ebenezer Scrooge, who lives to make money and very little else. He sits in his house and counts his money, spends it only when he has to, doesn't believe in religion, doesn't believe in God, until one Christmas Eve, he received a terrifying wake-up call from his old partner, Jacob Marley. Marley had died 7 Christmases ago, and he was a miser like Scrooge, come to visit Scrooge, bound and wrapped in terrible chains. Jacob had been condemned to roam the face of the earth, tormented to death by the things he'd neglected in life. Marley was desperate to give his old colleague a final chance to avoid the same fate. Marley made it clear that this was Scrooge's only opportunity to turn from his selfish ways. Marley explained that 3 more spirits would visit him. Spirits of Christmas past, Christmas present, and Christmas future. So when the clock struck 1 a.m., the spirit of Christmas past arrived and took Scrooge on an unforgettable trip down memory lane, on a visit to his own childhood. As the spirit took him into schoolroom, we see a lonely little boy sitting by the fire, whose only companion is the book he was reading. Scrooge remembered that loneliness and how he longed for the presence of friends. He recalled his past decades' desires for the love and approval of his family, but when he saw all the people who tried to reach out to him, who attempted to stop his slide into self-absorption, he realized the God of money was in control. He saw his form a poor second to Scrooge's obsession for wealth. "A golden idol displaces me," she says. "All hopes have merged to a master passion. The thought of money engrosses you." If Scrooge had been shaken by the visit to his first spirit, the second one was no less disturbing. The spirit of Christmas present arrived to take him on a tour of the people he knew. Eventually he found himself standing in the home of his poor clerk, Bob Cratchit, where he had felt the warmth of a large and friendly family who were making the best of what little they could afford on the meager salary that Scrooge provided. Scrooge experienced their anxiety over the fate of Tiny Tim, their sick young child. Scrooge was clearly shown the effects of his selfish nature. The Spirit helped him understand that even though he was utterly hard-hearted, others had not given up on him. Cratchit sat down at the dinner table, and Bob actually thinks to toast his boss. Despite protest from his wife, Tiny Tim's response to the toast, God bless us, everyone. The final spirit, the spirit of Christmas future, arrives and had no face and it did speak. It merely pointed. Scrooge looked to where the spirit was pointing and saw the Cratchit family again, worn down in their struggle against poverty, and now Tiny Tim was dead. His lonely crutch stood unused in a corner. The spirit took Scrooge to visit the house of a man who had died in his sleep. A maid and a cleaner were dividing up his belongings before the undertaker arrived. Two associates out in the street were discussing whether it was even necessary to hold a funeral, since no one would bother to come. Who is this man? Asked Scrooge. The spirit led him to a grave, whose headstone bore the name Ebenezer Scrooge, died 1843. No other words adorned his grave marker. The two grave diggers leave the open grave to visit the local pub. It seems that Scrooge lived long enough to make it miserable for everyone. Thankfully for Scrooge, he recognized this as a life-changing moment, and it was now or never. Scrooge asked whether it's possible to mend his ways and so alter his life and destiny. Surely the spirits wouldn't be visiting him if not. As Christmas morning dawns, he awakes a transformed man. Scrooge realized he'd been given a reprieve, a second chance. Dickens believed that we all had been given another chance, only because of the birth of Jesus, the true hero of the greatest Christmas story. And at the heart of the Christmas Carol lies Scrooge's amazing transformation. He changes from a selfish, greedy, bitter old man to a grateful, generous, and compassionate human being. He stopped serving the god of money and began to use money to bless others. Scrooge was a man who saw his life transformed to the point where Dickens concludes that he became as good a friend and as good a master and as good a man as the good old city had ever known. As a matter of fact, the last line says he knew how to keep Christmas in his heart year round, because he'd been transformed. And there's only one thing that can really transform us. That's Jesus Christ. When you look at your life and I look at mine, do we see too much Scrooge living in us? Maybe like Scrooge, we too are living too selfishly, too focused on our greed. Maybe like Scrooge, we too are not valuing people as we should. Maybe like Scrooge, we too need a Christmas Eve conversion. If we turn to God and submit ourselves to Him, He will do a wonderful work in our lives, and He will take the God of money and He will replace it with the one true God. Because no idol can be just yanked down. It has to be replaced, and it has to be replaced with something stronger, and that is God Himself. God is the only hope you have of destroying the God of money's hold on your life. So where are you? Where do you stand? Let's close in prayer. We stand before an amazing God, Lord. It's so shocking to realize that we forget sometimes that Dickens wrote that story as a Christian tale. He intended that to glorify you, to show how you transform. How the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future were really all about the God who transforms lives. I think we forget that sometimes. It's just a story for us. Help us to remember, Lord, that You're the only one that can change our hearts. You're the only one that can change our lives. Money can't do it. Food can't do it. Entertainment can't do it. None of that will solve our problems. We must